Good morning. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Most Important Events and Surprises in the ATM's History, presented by ATM Marketplace and sponsored by Pendon and the publishers of Cashbox. I'm Suzanne Clucky, editor of ATM Marketplace. To begin, I'd like to encourage you to stay for today's entire presentation, including the live Q&A session we'll have toward the end of the hour. You can submit a question at any time during the webinar by typing it into the chat window in the bottom left corner of your screen. Also, I want to let you know that today's presentation, including the slide deck, will be available later for download at atmmarketplace.com. When it posts, we'll send you an email notification with a link, which you're welcome to share with others who couldn't make today's event. This morning, we're joined by the co-authors of the book Cashbox, A History of the ATM. Bernardo Batiz-Lazo is Professor of Business History and Bank Management at Bangor University in Wales. Tom Harper is President of Networld Media Group and publisher of ATM Marketplace. He is also a founder of the ATM Industry Association and the organization's current president. Today, they're going to talk us through an informal history of the ATM and tell us how a simple machine evolved into a global industry. And they're going to highlight some of the aha moments along the way that have guided the ATM's progress through the last 50 years, and then some of the more recent events that will help shape its future. Good morning, Bernardo and Tom. It's great to have you with us.
Good morning.
I will now turn the stage over to you.
Well, this is Tom, and I understand that it may be afternoon for some of you around the world, so good afternoon or evening, wherever you are. We see that we have many people joining from around the world, so thank you. I'd like to just kind of talk about the scope of the research a little bit and kind of how we got going, what questions we had. First of all, we really wanted to know how did cash come about, and why is there still a love affair with it today? And so we did some research on that back into the annals of worldwide history, and we found out some really interesting things. And then of course, the big question of the hour was who really invented the ATM? There seemed to be some controversy, and we wanted to answer that. And I feel like we did. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Thirdly, we wanted to find out what factors caused the machine to spread so quickly around the world. It really disregarded borders and cultures and just proliferated, almost like a virus. You know, it just kind of went around the entire world. And then we want to find out about regulation and legislation. What is the kind of the macro story that is governing our industry, so to speak? And then finally, we heard about this cashless society, and the big question was, is it coming, and what impact will it have on the ATM? And so those were the questions we started with, Suzanne, and you know the kind of the overarching reason we wrote the book was that there really wasn't a comprehensive history of the industry that has been written yet. So, I mean, we had 5 decades of history behind us, and there's a lot of water under the bridge, so to speak, to write about. And when you couple that with the amount of contacts that Bernardo and I have in the industry, a lot of friends we've known for years, people we've written about and worked with, we found a really compelling reason to write this book. And the final reason was that I'm seeing, I don't know if you on the phone here are also seeing this, but there's quite a bit of turnover. There are a lot of new people coming into the industry who could really benefit from an overview of the historical perspective, how we got to where we are today, and that could kind of take some of the time and expense of their training out if they could just kind of study the book. And that, with all that in mind, just real quickly, kind of meeting Bernardo. Bernardo's based in Wales. I like to call him my Mexican friend based in Wales. I met him after just researching online. I wanted to find someone who had already done some work and had a lot of history already in hand and had done the research. And so I searched and found Bernardo as a co-author of an article, several articles about the history of payments and banking and bank technology and ATMs. And I emailed him, and it was, as he puts it, perfect timing. And so, Bernardo, let me hand it off to you, and you can add your own piece to that story.
Thank you very much, Tom. Yes, indeed, I had been working in payment systems and the introduction of computers into banking. And as part of that, I found that there was a dearth of systematic studies around the development of the cash machine. And I thought that that was a neat technology to explore how changes in the marketplace were also taking place, or feeding back to inside the organization. So the ATM could be the backbone of this story. And fortunately, I got some grants, a large grant from the British Academy, a smaller grant to go and visit some archives in the US and to talk to some people. And as part of this, one of the things that I found was close links with all the related technologies, primarily in the self-service area, coming out from some of the developments and some of the innovations that came out from making this transition from cash dispensing to an ATM. So, Suzanne, why don't I tell you a little bit more about the material that we gathered when we're starting this project? Yeah.
Sure.
So, well, as Tom and I met and started to discuss, well, we had all of this material that I had been putting together for a couple of years. He had also attracted a number of people through LinkedIn and making or eliciting stories from people from the industry, as Tom is very well known within the industry, and that helped us start filling the gaps. So we were not short of material. It was really trying to follow all of these leads and putting things together and working our way through this vast number of boxes and stuff. And with the challenge that we started this about a year ago, we met early June in London, and Tom wanted to deliver the book by Christmas, and I said I was game, but that's probably one of the first things that we had to do was to overcome some of the myths that were in the internet. No?
Well, I thought if it was on the internet, it had to be true.
Yeah, of course.
But apparently that's not so. And I'm wondering, in terms of dispelling myths or, really finding out the real information, what were your biggest surprises when you were doing the research, Bernardo?
Well, first, Suzanne, one of the things that we had to debunk was primarily who was the inventor and whether this story of inspiration in a bathtub with a rubber duck was really the story there or not, and what was behind this. And what we found was very strong links between engineers, bankers, and ultimate users as how a complex technology was coming together and would drive the evolution of the industry. So one of the things that we found is that there was not one single event, but as we see now in the slide, there were several groups, and we were able to identify at least 4 groups. One of them in Sweden and 3 of them in the UK. All of them deploying, 3 of them deploying 1967. The other one a little bit later, and it's the one that we have here, and it's the only photograph that we were able to find of one of the original groups working with the technology. And you can see that there's a number of engineers, and at the back, more or less, you can see how bulky these early machines were, and bulky in all senses in terms of dimension. And then, for example, the fascia is a solid piece of stainless steel, no, to arrive in or try to avoid the theft and that sort of thing, and shows the preoccupation from the bankers in security very early on. Secondly, we were also, or one of the things that surprised me is how late the capabilities to abandon direct dial-up came to be, and this really took place until 1994, 1996, and it's mirroring, or some of these changes are happening inside of the machine, are then echoing in the growth of the installed base. For example, in the US, there were, in the early 1990s, there were some 80,000 machines deployed, which grew to about 500,000 by 2009. And, all the way of looking at this is that by 1971, only 11 countries had deployed at least one machine. And these included France, Sweden, the USA, Canada, and Israel. By 1980, we had 26 countries. And by 1990, we have no less than 55 countries. The machine is really going global by the late 80s and early 1990s. So this led us to a third bit of surprise, and that was how long-lived the ideas of self-service and cashless are. And this relates, for example, we have here in the slide the figure from one of the early, what was supposed to be one of the early models of cash dispensing. It's not really cash dispenser, is the bankograph by Simjian. And this machine, which again in the internet is wrongly identified as being early or being deployed or designed in 1939, and it's a typo, it's really 1959, that's the date on the patent, was used, or is important because it was used as prior art by all of the subsequent patents in cash machines. And this is not really a cash machine because it's really a deposit machine. As you can see, there is a little bit of a hole in there, and it would just accept checks, take a photograph, and print a receipt. But anyway, it was, all of these ideas of self-service were coming together in the late 1950s and in 1960s, and they see their materialization around different forms, one of them being the cash machine.
Yeah, interesting. I didn't realize that the machine actually took a photograph of the check, so it's a little check. Tom, what were your biggest surprises as you were doing the research?
Well, just to key off of that comment, that bankograph taking pictures of checks sort of sounds like remote deposit capture to me.
Exactly.
Maybe we have the app's precursor here back in 1959. I would say my first surprise was the power of secondary economies. People call these shadow economies. The main definition is that these are the parts of our economy in any given country that are just not registered for taxation. This informal sector includes tipping service providers like cab drivers, bellhops, sky cabs, waiters, making purchases in open-air markets, garage sales. You see here a picture of a money changer in Somaliland. The currency is so devalued there that you have to almost cart around a full wheelbarrow full of cash just to buy lunch. And so you're looking at the world's first completely analog ATM in the form of a man. And I don't know if he accepts cards, but he certainly dishes out the cash. But if you look at the numbers worldwide, this secondary economy in the EU makes up about 48 million workers. In India, it's actually 90% of the total available jobs there, or that's about 360 million workers. So this is a major part of the world economy. In fact, in South Africa, it's 25% of the labor force, and it's responsible for 10% of all retail sales. In Russia, it's about 14% of total employment. And when you look at the whole global picture, informal trade is about 30% of global GDP. So if you take that to the next logical conclusion, from a payment standpoint, if we modernize the world by going to 100% electronic payments, most countries would see their economies shrink drastically, on average about a third. Cash really fuels this growth and supports the growth, and I believe cash is an underappreciated pillar of financial stability around the world. And I can talk all day about that one. I'm going to move on. My second surprise was somewhat related, but that was that I always assumed that the cashless society was slowly creeping in as this inevitable future. But now I realize that this assumption doesn't really conform to reality. There's pockets where it's taking root, Sweden and Netherlands and France, but it's really not sweeping the globe. if you look at your slide here, in Europe, RBR found that cash accounted for 78% of all retail payments in 2008, 93% in Central and Eastern Europe. Capgemini said that in 2011, more than 80% of all payments worldwide were made in cash. And Aegis Consulting said that more than half of the value of U.S. currency is held in foreign countries, and that's major. When you pull cash out, you really got some problems. So obviously there's a need, and there's a desire for cash. One of the things along these lines of cashless is that it's a bit of a contrived future, in that the card schemes appear to be declaring war on cash. Now, I'm not denouncing them at all. I'm just saying that's a natural outcome in a competitive environment. You've got the card schemes that make money off of people using other payment options besides cash when they use plastic. So, but despite the best efforts of the public relations departments and agencies with these companies, culture is really not shifting away from cash toward mobile in this great wave. I mean, it's happening, as I said, in some countries around the world. But what's actually going on that we've seen is that the non-cash options are shuffling. So people are starting to experiment with mobile at the expense of cards, and this is in the aggregate. Again, there's pockets where where people are leaving cash to mobile, let's say, or cash to credit, but not in the aggregate. And so this is why the card companies are even pushing their own mobile solutions. Cards in their plastic form or even with chips are just a technology, and technology changes. So as we see evolution from plastic to mobile, we're going to see a lot of painful change. We're going to see a lot of resistance to that change, but I think culture and consumers are going to pull us there. And I also see that cash is growing around the world. We've seen that cash is growing both in transactions and hoarding. So the good news is the entire payment pie is growing. And so this statement here you see on the slide is really the key for considering this so-called cashless society. Cash is an option. It's an optional tool for those who want to use it. It's not this cancer that needs to be removed. Many people choose not to use cash as their primary payment mechanism, but most of them still carry it as backup, or for gifts, or I carry it primarily for emergencies, backup if someplace doesn't take my form of payment, or I got to pay somebody, P2P payment. But the key is that cash represents choice and consumer freedom, and I don't really see a benefit to society for removing choice and kind of telling society what they want. They should be telling us.
Yeah, I think most people would agree with you on that. So that's in theory, but how do choice and consumer freedom operate in the real world? Can you give me an example?
Well, I'm glad you asked, Suzanne. We have some slides here that show that. Let's move to the next one. This shows the beginning of my day. I am going to Starbucks. I love using my mobile payment app. Hopefully most of you are familiar with that. Starbucks just said recently, either today or yesterday, that I think they get about 10% of their total global sales through their mobile app, which is a staggering figure. But I go and I pay for my coffee. And the reason I do that is because I want to track my points, because they will send me a notification. If you look at the bottom, it says My Rewards down at below the guy's thumb. That's not my thumb. But you touch that, and it shows you how many more purchases you need to get a free coffee. And so that's how I use it. And then when I go to lunch, I use my credit card. And the reason I do that is because I want it to automatically be recorded as a business expense. I don't want to have to transfer or get reimbursed or anything like that. This is my company credit card. So that's the reason I use that. It's just convenient for me. Then I finish lunch, and I've got to go to the gas station and fill up. So I want to use my personal debit card, because that's my personal account, and I keep track of my purchases there. I also have a credit card if I want to use that, but I use my debit card as a habit. All right, and then later on that afternoon or over dinner, I go have time with a friend, and I realize that I owe him $10 from a bet that I lost. So he said, hey, I've got a PayPal account, and I really want you to pay me so I don't have to, like, convert it. Can you just, like, dump it into my PayPal account because I want to go buy this thing on eBay? And so I open up my PayPal app, and I send the money to him right away, and it goes right into his account. And that was a mobile payment, you know?
Right.
So now, the next day, which is Saturday, I noticed that there's a garage sale down the street. And I go down there and I notice there are no cash registers, there are no POS devices, there is a shoebox with a 10-year-old girl sitting there taking the money. And I pull out my card and she gives me the look. She said, cash, buddy. And so I have to use cash. And there's a perfect example of ease of use and convenience. So when you put all this together, you can see why my choices dictate what payment tools I use. And, you know, another reason that cashless won't work, other than choice, is that it relies on electricity and connectivity. What if there's no signal available to allow my transaction to be processed? You know, what if there's a natural disaster? All the power goes out. What if my phone dies and I haven't charged it, or I used the GPS and it sucked out all the juice of the battery? What if my phone's stolen, or I just for some reason can't use it to pay? Then there's lots of merchants who can't afford the POS equipment or the card acceptance costs, the transaction costs.
Right.
What if I don't even have a bank account or even a phone yet? You know, what if I'm just kind of entering into the world economy because I'm, you know, young and I'm just starting to make purchases and I haven't been allowed to have a phone yet? Cash answers every one of those scenarios. And the good news, it comes in the form of a research statistic from RBR, and they predict that global cash withdrawals will increase 8% per year through 2016. And by that year of 2016, we will be close to 100 billion cash withdrawals per year, and we're at about 70 billion now. So that says a lot about the future prospects for our industry and this machine we all lovingly call the cash box.
Right. Well, we're seeing that in emerging markets. The take-up is really quick in, you know, India, China, Brazil, all over the place. We're seeing a lot of very fast take-up, and I don't think it'll be long before we hit 100 billion. So, in terms of some of the moments in history that really shaped the progress of the industry, what would you say were the ones that had the most drastic effect on where the industry is today? Bernardo?
Yes, thank you very much, Suzanne. Well, probably the first one is invention, of course. And as we've said, or as I said a moment ago, there is evidence that there were independent efforts, 3 in the UK, 1 in Sweden, and 1 that we know very little about in Japan. There are some unconfirmed references, or whether some unconfirmed references of some developments around the Tokyo Olympics of 1964. But probably around this time of invention, if we change slide, please. What we have here is the token that activated the Chubb MD2. And this was a machine that was developed by, on the one hand, the British clearing banks, and particularly what was then Westminster Bank, that is today part of Royal Bank of Scotland. Chubb, which at the time was one of the major providers of safes, and an outfit out in Scotland called Smith Industries. And they outsourced the world. A number of engineering firms took part, or different parts, to build this machine together. The main contractor was, as I said, Chubb. And Smith Industries was one that had to devise the activation token. Smith Industries has a much longer history, and they relate to Lord Kelvin and stuff that we won't go into it now. The point is that this was the first time, or of the initial machines, the only one that created what today we know as PIN, and it is them, a group of people, which included James Goodfellow, who developed the personal identification number and a personal access number. And it's a big breakthrough because it allows, with some degree of certainty, at least for these early innovators, that the person that has the card is supposed to be entitled to access the funds. And this idea of linking the electronic debiting and crediting, although indirectly early on, but now we do it at the point of the transaction, with the individual that has that ownership of the funds was a key concept that still permeates our industry and a number of elements in self-service until today. This PIN-PAN device was patented, and actually James Goodfellow was raised to the Payments Hall of Fame in the U.S. and has been praised by the U.S. UK Patent Office. No? So in a way, this PIN-PAN was a breakthrough, and you can see how rustic it is. In a way, it's still using punch holes within the card
right.
to access the algorithm. Now, this analog type of solution, or this very early solution, had a number of problems. And for example, there is this story that the machines developed in Sweden had a very weak security, and somebody, we don't know if it's one person or a group of persons, were able to go around Sweden on an Easter break, debiting a number of machines that they didn't have, just basically what we today would call hacking. And this was not found out until after the long weekend, and even today we don't know who the persons were. So, this race to really make the whole transaction electronically then start, and we have some early developments, most notably there is one in Japan around what is called today Omron, and at that point in time it was called Omron Tateishi. They had been working in transport systems and again, links to other forms of self-service. But more important, throughout the 1970s and the early 80s is the work of IBM. IBM started and did some examples or some trials with online debiting in Sweden, but really it was the machine that was developed in conjunction with Lloyds Bank in 1972, which linked a group of or their all of their ATMs to the mainframe. Now, what we see around the 1970s was machines that work in different modes. Some of them worked offline, some of them worked on a batch mode, and then some others were all linked to the mainframe. With the added, with a number of challenges that the IBM group or the engineers at IBM had to solve, because these were copper wires. They were the speed at which data could be transmitted at this point in time was, infinitesimally small compared to what we can do today. But nevertheless, IBM somehow lost the plot, and they tried to introduce a new system in the early 1980s, which was the IBM 4731, 4736 cash dispensers. And that was a fiasco because they had been very successful at deploying another machine, the IBM 3624. And it opened up the possibility for the likes of Diebold and NCR to come into the market. NCR started to produce machines out of Dundee, Scotland, with an emulator for the IBM, and that's how they started to gain market share. The picture that we have on our screen right now is that plant in Dundee, and one of the other things that they do is that they introduce modular components, and that is, instead of having one big clunky machine that was all integrated, and therefore if a small part failed, the whole machine would shut down, they started to play with this module so that if one module failed, the machine on normal circumstances could continue to work. And more or less at this time, of some of the developments that NCR and Diego start to introduce come hand in hand with the development of networks or shared networks, particularly in the U.S., where there were at one point about 200 different networks of shared machines. Whereas in Europe, what we had was primarily large banks with a much denser branch base, developing their own proprietary networks. So one of the other points that happens, or towards the end of the 1980s, where another big jump happens, is the introduction of PC-like microprocessors, and that is really, or the breakthrough that comes with that, is that the possibility and actually the possibility of being able to control the machine remotely to really act as a terminal of a central machine or a central computing system comes into play. At the same time that from the end of the 1970s we have the non-stop computing or this fault accepting systems, which basically enable large number of transactions to be processed without the central computing being shut down, which was the model that IBM had been proposing, everything locked into one mainframe, and when the mainframe had problems, well, the whole network would come down. And really, therefore, by the end of the 1980s, what we have is the ATM as a platform, very much like we have today the iPhone or the Android, something that is integral to the payments ecosystem. And therefore, we go to our third big moment, which is the emergence of the independent ADA deployer. And this associates, in my mind, to the deployment of ATMs in off-bank premises, in casinos, shops like we see in the graph, universities, everywhere, where there is no longer a dial-up, or one of the things that the likes of Triton do is machines that will only connect to the network when the transaction is taking place, as opposed to what we had, for example, in the 1970s, where you have to have a dedicated line for the machine to work. So, finally, it's just to wrap it up. This, the industry in a way comes full circle, because as bankers are seeing that moving cash, they feel that it's a cost. ADAs have a different business model, and they show that there is a profit opportunity in moving cash.
Interesting. Yeah, definitely. And it really seems like things just started to explode in the 90s and really take off. It's a fascinating evolution, but I'm wondering if Tom, you could give us some examples of some more recent game changers.
Sure. Well, I got into the industry in 97 or so, and at that time, of course, the MasterCard and Visa surcharge ban had been lifted, and so I'm going to name that as one of my big three events in the industry's history, because it really at that point changed the business model. I mean, many of us who were around then in the industry remember the proliferation of off-premise machines, and certain manufacturers that were already in that space really enjoyed growth, a quick growth, as the other manufacturers also got into it. And it also drastically changed the regulatory landscape in the U.S. And there was this whole new footprint of machines that needs to be regulated in some different ways. Consumers had greater, more convenient access to their cash. If you look at the next slide, this was at that time. I had met the man on the left, Ernest Burdett, one of the founders of Triton. His co-founders, Frank Willem and Robert Sandals, are also pictured. This was just a fun picture. Reminded me of the Bill Gates pictures back when he was in his early days of Microsoft.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. My second moment, I think, was the birth of ATMIA, because it organized the industry for the first time, and it allowed the industry to have a single voice, especially with legislative and regulatory issues. And as you see in the exhibit hall here, on the next slide, you've got a typical environment where everybody has a face-to-face chance to do business, and this is happening all over the world. This picture I took in London at the recent ATMIA Europe show, and of course it happens everywhere. We're doing the first conference in India, there's one in Australia, and Canada, and Africa, and throughout Europe, and so it really is providing this collaborative catalyst for the industry. My third moment, I think, would have to be remote monitoring. This simple functionality really opened up a whole new world for this off-premise deployment. It gave an economy of scale because now you could remotely monitor with one person a whole slew of machines. And this continued to fuel the financial convenience that we were giving consumers because now we could more economically service machines and keep them up and running and monitor them.
Right. And as we always hear about, availability is king in the ATM industry. So you've presented us with this wonderful history of the ATM, the events that led up to it. Why does it matter for us to understand the history that you compiled? Bernardo, why don't you start with that one?
Well, I think that the first one is that we want a better understanding of how the past helps accelerate a more solid future. Acknowledging the basic links and dynamics between bankers, engineers, and customers in the design and development of the market and the payment system in general is very much a thing from today. I was talking, for example, earlier on with some friends at the Evolt, and they've come up with this, trying to optimize how individual consumers can engage with this technology. But it's different groups that are influencing this development. The other thing that I think that is important is how or we can take learning points from the U.S. market and to the European market and vice versa. There are things which are specific to each of them, but trying to go beyond this and trying to see and really embody how lessons can be learned, and I know that it's a cliche, but it's through the understanding of the process that this learning and knowledge can really go, and for that you have to sit back and consider what were our expectations at that point in time, why were they met, why weren't they not met, and what sort of other influences came into play in the process. Yes, idiosyncrasies and really how we can develop greater knowledge. Mm-hmm.
Okay. John, what would you say? Why does history matter?
Yeah, I think history helps us understand where we are in our industry's life cycle and also where our individual businesses are. What I mean is, when you look at an industry, any industry, you see a bell curve. And many industries are mature and they're at the top of the curve, or they're in decline and they're on the way down. Pay phones will be way down in the trough of decline, whereas mobile phones are at the beginning trough. So every industry has that life cycle. And to determine where any company is on its own life cycle, you need to understand where we are as an industry. Are we commoditized completely? Where is the innovation taking place? And so I would say if you look at your own company and you figure out, okay, where am I in my life cycle? You can ask yourself those questions. Is what we do as a company commoditized, or is there room for innovation? How do we price our products and services? Are they on the front end or back end of the sector's life cycle? So, you have your industry, and then within the industry there are some sectors that have different life cycles. The second question I would ask is, within my sector, what are adoption rates for what I am offering? And I think we've all seen that this industry has been slow to adopt new technology on average. So you really need to have patience if your customers don't jump right away at your whiz-bang advances. I mean, they typically come around. Thirdly, I would ask, how can I actually profit from regulation? We have no shortage of regulation, especially with all the new payment developments. But this is probably the biggest driver of innovation, as we're constantly forced to find new sources of profit and meet these new payment security requirements. We have all these costs getting poured into the industry, and it's left to us to figure out how to wring out more profits. So understanding how the industry has reacted in the past and understanding how the government and various agencies view us says a lot about the future, because we know there will be no end to regulation. So let's figure out how they think, and let's get ahead of them a little bit. And then finally, a question to ask myself if I'm in this industry is how I'm dealing with mobile. Again, the number one technology that's disrupting everything, not just payments, but pretty much almost every industry out there. I believe that we're at the beginning of a renewal of the ATM industry as it's fueled by mobile. We have pre-staged ATM transactions. We have QR code transaction. We have texted receipts. All kinds of convergence of the ATM and the mobile channel. In fact, there's so much we're seeing that NetWorld is putting on a conference just on that topic in Washington, D.C. In September. And it's the ATM and Mobile Executive Summit. But you get more information on the site about that. But it's really interesting to see how this convergence is changing the ATM industry. And you've got things like a Diebold concept machine where the screen is in the shape of a phone that's turned on its side, and you can touch the screen and pinch and and scroll using your fingers, and so it's just like a phone experience. And I think that's really key as the millennial generation grows older. They're going to demand everything have that same type interface. So those are the questions that I would ask in regard to history. How is it affecting me? Where is my company on its own life cycle? Where is our industry? Where is my sector on its life cycle? And with regard to history unfolding before our eyes, how am I dealing with mobile?
Right. Well, just as a kind of a follow-up, you had mentioned some of the additional revenue makers that are coming on the scene. Slowly, some of them. For instance, lottery tickets at the ATM. How important do you think those will ultimately be to the future of the industry?
Well, I'll take that one first, Bernardo. I think there are a lot of these applications that are going to be effective in limited scenarios. There may be a theater network that finds that it's more economical for them to go ahead and buy machines and then to develop an app just for their machines. And they can find that their ATMs can double as kiosks. Well, some of us in the industry in the past have seen that happen, and we, and I include myself, we thought that was going to be a trend, that ATMs would be doing things like tickets and stamps and so forth, when in actuality it was either an experiment or it was a closed loop kind of an application. And so there will be more of those that come up as people bolt on different functionality to the machine. I think remote deposit capture at the ATM machine is a valuable one that will get some more traction as people get more used to doing that same thing on their phone. But Bernardo, what about you?
Sorry, I don't know. It's just probably I don't know what could I add after you've said, Tom.
Yeah.
It's just that you've covered some of the. Yeah,
well, that's okay. Because I have a question for you, Bernardo. I think that you're the guy that asked this one. You had talked about the PIN pan and the computer punch cards, which take me way back. But I'm wondering, when did the magnetic stripe card become the standard for making an ATM transaction?
That's a good one. There is also some debate as to when the mag stripe came in, and depends how you look at it. IBM has usually tried to take most credit of that, but again, this other Japanese company, Tateishi Omron, they had the earliest patent on magnetic stripes because they were using it to automate Tokyo transit. Especially one of the busiest stations in Tokyo is Shibuya. So that was the first. That's where the tickets. I don't know. I grew up in Mexico, and tickets there and in Paris they still have the magnetic stripe at the back. So that's if you ever been around, that's what they were introducing in Japan. Now, but in terms of the ATM, well, as we said, IBM used it. The group that we showed the photograph, which is Spaytech, and they were working with Midland Bank, they were also using it with a bigger card. But really, this comes around the mid-70s, between 1975 and 1977, when the international standard on the size of the cards for the credit cards comes around. Yeah, and the old-timers will know this, or they used to call it the Track 3 because it was rewritten. But the Spaytech machines that eventually are marketed under Burroughs, on the Burroughs bank until Burroughs they first left the ATM market around 1982, 1984. So the standard is fixed. It's coming from the credit cards, but you have to remember. Well, no, you have to remember. But not every ATM was activated with a credit card. Until the late 80s, many banks and many networks had or could be activated with their own token, or credit card-like token, or ATM card, or a credit card themselves.
Right. I remember getting my first ATM card. I think it was in the mid-'80s, and it was usable only at my bank. So it's pretty interesting to see how that has evolved over the years. We have some questions from our audience, and so I want to go to those. This is the big drum roll question, I guess. Who ultimately is credited for inventing the ATM? Tom, why don't you take that?
Well, I think I saw a comment in there that we have celebrated John Shepard Barron, and that's very true. In fact, we gave him an award at the ATM's 40th anniversary. I did the ATMIA show several years ago, and it was a real honor to meet him. And there's a picture of him on the back of our book that we got just a few years before he died, actually. And so he has played a major role in the invention. And I would say that there are a couple different people. Don Wetzel was one in the U.S., but, I have actually relied on Bernardo's expertise in this area because I had the same question coming into this, and he helped dispel. So, Bernardo, how's that for a handoff deferral to you?
Thank you very much.
I was wondering if your answer would be the same as Tom's.
No. Sorry, just picking up from some of the comments in the chat here. Anthony Cleaver has kindly pointed out that the IBM 2984, announced in 71 and installed in 72, which is the Lloyd's machine, already used a MaxRide card, but so did the Burroughs / Spaytech early on in 69 and 67, and so did the Onron in Japan. So it's a little bit of a contested history as to who used the magnetic card. There also one of the other questions coming from the chat, and I'm sidestepping your question, sorry there, Suzanne, is what was the contribution from DocuTel? And probably in my mind, and I'm not trying to minimize what they're doing, DocuTel came to Europe and saw the machines that were deployed because the Bankomat, which is the machine that is coming from Sweden, and the Chop are exported very quickly and throughout European banks, even to the former USSR. There was one installation there, to the extent that in many Eastern European countries, Bankomat is the name that they give to the ATM. However, DocuTel is, at least in terms of the patent record, the first time that a whole ATM appears as a complete system, right? So they are important, and they are, of course, important in helping to develop the market. And the question was also said, why did they what was their demise, and to some extent, like Chubb and like other early entrants, they could not keep up with the development in electronics and in integrated circuits and all of these areas where the likes of IBM were leading the charge worldwide, right? So who was the inventor? I don't think that there is a single inventor, because I think that the ATM and the cash machine are a complex technology, and you need teams of people, and it is both in Sweden and in the UK is a device that results from bankers approaching engineers and asking them for a solution to be able to provide out of hours access to deposits and to cash in this way. And you just have to see, that all of the components that come into it and how different people have been contributing to the development of this machine. And there's really no, one single person that was working in his or her garage and came up with this machine and took it to a bank, and they said, "Oh, great idea," and then everybody else copied it. But it was the bank's working. It was a savings banks in Sweden and the clearing banks in the UK, who as a group came together. And one of the other things that the historical record shows is that at least in the UK, they had the engineers working in separate projects, and the engineers didn't know that the other projects existed, but the bankers did, and they talked about what was happening with one or the other.
And I think from a macro historical standpoint, we found in the patent record patents that led from one to the other, and it was almost this evolutionary progression through patents that led up to the ATM. We saw the bankograph that took a check. So there was the concept of a self-service financial machine for consumers. Well, then people figured out they could do other things, and then it soon became a cash dispenser, but it wasn't really an ATM fully yet. It was mechanical.
Right.
And then it wasn't online yet, so it really wasn't today's ATM. And that was one of the other surprises that I had, was how evolutionary it was. As Bernardo said, it wasn't conceived in a garage or in a bathtub. At one point in time, it was more of a conglomeration of collaboration and creativity and invention.
Right. So it's not like the Macintosh, which sort of arrived fully formed as a product. Interesting. So we'll really never know the answer to that, I guess, is the answer. You mentioned that cash volumes, Tom, will continue to increase until 2016. Do you think that we're going to be seeing more of the kiosk-type ATMs replacing tellers in brick-and-mortar branches? I know we have, video teller. I know we have, advanced automation deposit machines. So how important will those be?
Well, we are experiencing a reduction, at least in the U.S., of the number of branches. And we're continuing to move towards self-service. Mobile banking is playing a huge role in that. And ATMs are actually becoming the hub of banking services. Let's say you got your phone and you want to pay a bill. You can do it right there on the phone. But if you want to get cash, you don't necessarily have to have a bank account. You can convert, in the future, you'll be able to convert bitcoins into cash. You can convert, various currencies, and from various accounts around the world. It might even be a government payment account, electronic benefits transfer. Where you pull it out at an ATM machine, but you don't need a bank account. I do think that ATM proliferation will continue because of mobile, because people are used to doing things at their own time, how they want to, with a device. And an ATM is going to continue to evolve to meet the cultural changes and kind of the design features that today's culture is expecting. And it's all revolving around that handheld. And so, I do think that new kinds of ATMs will be coming out, but mostly just in the look and feel. They're going to do basically the same thing with additional mobile top-up ability and mobile interactivity.
Right. Okay. We have a question. I'm kind of interested in knowing this as well. people dominated the U.S. market in the 1980s. How did they get to that position? Bernardo?
Right. Thank you very much, Susan. I was writing something at the same time. So basically, well, very, very shortly, they first piggyback on Chubb as they had done some research on developing their own ATM around the 1970, 1972. There are no less than some 20 different ATM providers in the U.S. or that they were offering some form of cash machine. And so they first installed some Chubb MD2 in the U.S. They found them that they were not resilient, that they had problems with security, so they abandoned that contract and invested heavily in their own research and development, particularly thinking or trying to move away from what the Europeans were doing and thinking more about where U.S. people were going, into supermarkets and into trying to develop some early off-banking premises machines. They were probably one of the first ones. So this research and development and attention to how the consumers were engaging with the technology at the same time that the so-called IBM fiasco opens up a market, because really IBM had the muscle, the knowledge, capabilities, the R&D, and the marketing muscle to dominate this market, but they choose not to do it. They had other problems, of course. I mean, they had bigger problems in Big Blue in the early 80s, and
right.
that a big market, a big and growing market for the likes of NCR and the Able, particularly or especially, as also at this time the likes of Tandem are coming with their non-stop machines. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yes.
Well, we have some other questions that we are not going to be able to get to, but I promise that our presenters will answer those separately after the event. We could go on with this conversation for quite a while, I'm sure. But that's it for today, and we hope that you'll stay connected to the topic at atmmarketplace.com. If you did ask a question, or if you think of a question later that you didn't ask today, you can email it to one of the email addresses that you see on your screen, and they will get back to you with a reply. Following the webinar, you will receive a link to the replay. That email will also include a discount code for the purchase of the book Cashbox, as well as information on where you can buy the book if you'd like to do that. Additionally, if you're interested in attending the ATM and Mobile Executive Summit, you'll find a link to the summit website at the atmmarketplace.com site on our homepage. You can use the code Harper when you register in order to receive a $700 discount, which will reduce the registration fee from $1,550 to $850. Thanks again to our sponsors at Pendant and Cashbox, and to our speakers, Bernardo and Tom. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. Have a great day.
Thanks, Suzanne.